Welcome back to Revenge Codex. My name is Scarlett Thomas. I'm 26 years old. And on the night of my own wedding, I stood in the rain outside a house that had my name on the mortgage, locked out by the man I had married 6 hours earlier. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not metaphorically locked out. Not emotionally locked out. Literally. Key in the lock. Turning. Nothing. The porch light off. My dress soaked through. My phone going to voicemail. The neighbor's windows dark. And me. Standing there with mascara running down my face, holding a pair of heels I'd taken off because my feet hurt, thinking this is my wedding night. What he didn't know was that I had already taken a photograph of every document in that house 3 weeks before the ceremony. But let's go back to the beginning. Because this story doesn't start at a locked door. It starts much earlier than that, in a version of me that I'm almost embarrassed to remember. Before I tell you anything else, I want to ask you something. And I mean this genuinely. Have you ever been in a situation where the person who was supposed to love you the most was also the person who saw you the least? Where you could be standing right in front of someone, fully present, fully trying, and they looked through you like glass. If you know that feeling, stay with me. This one's for you. Drop where you're watching from in the comments. I promise I read them. And I promise by the end of this, you'll understand why I asked. People who knew Marcus and me as a couple thought I was the lucky one. I heard it constantly. At bridal showers. At dinner parties. From his mother. Delivered with that particular smile women wear when they're insulting you while appearing to compliment you. Scarlett, you really landed on your feet with Marcus. He's going to take such good care of you, take care of me. As if I were a stray he'd adopted. Marcus was an architect. Successful. Yes. Well-dressed. Charming in the way that men who've been told they're charming their entire lives become charming. Reflexively, effortlessly, and utterly without substance. He had opinions about wine. He knew the right restaurants. He remembered the names of waitstaff exactly once and then never again, which he thought made him personable, and which I slowly understood made him calculating. What people didn't know about me, what I had never particularly advertised, was that I had a master's degree in financial law. That before I met Marcus at 23, I had already passed my bar exam and was working as a junior associate at a firm that specialized in asset protection and estate litigation. That I had grown up in a household where money was the language of power and I had learned to speak it fluently by the time I was 16, sitting at my father's kitchen table watching him lose everything he'd built because he hadn't protected it properly. I knew exactly what documents meant. I knew exactly what signatures could do. I knew exactly how a person's name on a piece of paper could be the difference between owning something and being evicted from it. But Marcus didn't know that. Or rather, Marcus knew I had some legal background and had decided that meant I was a paralegal. I had never corrected him. Not because I was ashamed. But because, from very early on, something in me noted the assumption and filed it quietly away. That matters. Remember that. We met at a mutual friend's gallery opening. He was confident. I was tired from a 70-hour work week and nursing a glass of Malbec in the corner. He walked over and said, "You look like someone who came here alone and is glad about it," which was true. And clever. And I thought, this one is interesting. He asked what I did. I said I worked in law. He nodded with the vague approval of someone who had already categorized me and moved on. He spent the next 20 minutes talking about a building he was designing in Copenhagen. I asked good questions. He glowed. That, I would later understand, was the template for our entire relationship. I asked good questions. He glowed. I made space. He expanded. I managed the details, the apartment lease, the utilities, the insurance, the grocery orders, the dinner reservations, while he operated in the elevated atmosphere of creative vision and important work. And slowly, incrementally, in the way that these things always happen too gradually for you to notice, until you're already deep inside them, I became invisible. Not to everyone. I want to be clear about that. My colleagues saw me. My mentor at the firm, a woman named Patricia who wore the same pearl earrings every day and had the most terrifying legal mind I have ever encountered. She saw me. My mother saw me. But Marcus saw a woman who handled things. A woman who was, to use his word, capable. He said it like a compliment. It landed like a classification. Scarlett handles that kind of thing. Scarlett's good with the details. You don't need to explain it. Scarlett will sort it out. I want to tell you about a specific night. Because specific nights are where patterns live. We were at a dinner party at his colleague Daniel's house. 8 people around a table. Marcus's professional circle. Mostly other architects. A developer. A couple whose precise function in Marcus's life I never fully determined. I was seated between Daniel's wife, who was lovely and who I genuinely liked, and a man named Garrett who worked in commercial real estate. Garrett asked me what I did. Before I could answer, Marcus from across the table, mid-conversation with someone else, turned and said, "She keeps my life organized," and then turned back. There was a half-second of silence. Garrett smiled at me politely. Daniel's wife refilled my wine glass. I said, "I work in asset protection law. Actually, estate litigation, trust structures, that kind of thing." Garrett's eyebrows went up. "Though, that's specialized work. Who do you practice with?" And I told him. And his expression shifted, that specific shift that happens when someone recalibrates who they think they are talking to. We had a real conversation. A good one. He gave me his card at the end of the night. On the drive home, Marcus was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You were holding court tonight." I said, "I was having a conversation." He said, "You don't have to perform for people." Scarlett, I didn't answer. I looked out the window at the city lights. And something in me went very, very still. That sentence mattered. I didn't fully understand why yet. But I stored it. The engagement was Marcus's idea, delivered in the way Marcus delivered most things, as a fait accompli. He'd already spoken to my father, already shown my mother the ring, already told his own family. By the time he got to me, the proposal was less a question than an announcement with a jewelry component. I said yes. Because I thought, and I want to be honest about this because honesty is the only thing worth offering, I thought that what we had was real. Flawed. Yes. Unbalanced. Certainly. But real. I thought that underneath the performance and the assumptions and the casual erasure, there was something that could grow into something better. I was wrong. But I wasn't wrong in the stupid way people assume when they say, "She should have known." I was wrong in the deeply human way that happens when you love someone and you keep choosing the most generous interpretation of their behavior until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The evidence, when it came, was not subtle. 3 months before the wedding, Marcus's mother came to stay for a week. Her name was Vivienne. She was elegant in that armor-plated way. She wore linen in colors that required confidence, oyster, ecru, a particular shade of pale blue. She had opinions about everything and delivered them as observations, which is a very specific and effective form of psychological control. On the second day of her visit, I came home from work to find Vivienne and Marcus sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers. Wedding finances, which I had been managing, as I managed most things. Marcus looked up and said, "Mom was just looking over the budget." She had some thoughts. Vivienne smiled. "I hope you don't mind, darling. I just wanted to make sure Marcus understood what he was committing to financially. I set my bag down. I said, "Of course," she proceeded to walk me through, in the tone of someone explaining a complex concept to a child, why the venue deposit was risky given that it was non-refundable, and whether we had considered that the guest list was perhaps overextended relative to the catering costs, and whether Scarlett, meaning me, had perhaps not fully thought through the downstream implications of the florist contract. I let her finish. Then I said, "The deposit is structured with a force majeure clause that covers venue insolvency and 3 categories of natural disaster. The catering contract is fixed price per head with a ceiling, not a per item model, which actually saves us approximately $400 at our current guest count. And the florist contract has a substitution provision I negotiated specifically because I was concerned about seasonal supply issues." Silence. Vivienne looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his coffee cup. I picked up my bag and went to change out of my work clothes. That night, after Vivienne had gone to bed, Marcus came to find me in the study. He sat on the edge of the desk and said, "You embarrassed her." I looked up from my laptop. I corrected a misunderstanding. She was trying to help. She was trying to establish that I didn't know what I was doing. She was wrong. I explained why. Marcus pressed his lips together. "You can be very cold sometimes." "Scarlett," I didn't say anything. He left the room. And that was the night, that specific night. Sitting in the blue glow of my laptop in the room that was technically a shared study, but was really my room. The room where I worked and thought, and existed in the parts of myself Marcus didn't see. That was the night I started paying closer attention. What happened next is the part I am almost reluctant to tell you, because it requires me to admit how much I already knew, and how long I let it continue. But I think that's important. I think the gap between knowing and acting is where the most honest part of this story lies. I started noticing things. Small things at first. A conversation Marcus had on the phone that stopped when I walked in. A bank statement that appeared on the kitchen counter and was removed before I could read it clearly. A weekend trip to see client in another city that generated no invoice. No follow-up. No professional result of any kind. I didn't confront him. This is the part people find hardest to understand. Why didn't I confront him? Because I had learned something from years of legal work that most people learn too late. Confrontation without evidence is just noise. It gives the other person a chance to adjust, to deflect, to gaslight. It tips your hand before you've built your case. So instead of confronting, I observed. And I prepared. This is what I need you to understand about the weeks leading up to that wedding. On the outside, I was a bride. I went to dress fittings. I tasted cake. I smiled in photographs. I addressed envelopes by hand because Marcus's mother had mentioned it was more personal. I gave every external performance of a woman in love with her upcoming life. On the inside, I was building a file. Not because I'd decided to leave. Not yet. But because something in my training, the years of legal work, the watching, the listening had activated a kind of professional clarity that runs parallel to emotional hope. I loved Marcus. I also knew that love without documentation is just a feeling, and feelings don't hold up in court. I photographed the financial documents I had access to. I noted the accounts I recognized and the ones I didn't. I spoke carefully, obliquely, under the guise of a professional hypothetical, to a colleague who specialized in marital asset law. I updated my own financial records. I moved my personal savings into an account in my name, only that I had opened quietly, without fanfare, at a bank Marcus had no relationship with. And 3 weeks before the wedding, I did one more thing. I sat down with the mortgage documents on the house we were about to share as a married couple. The house that Marcus had purchased 2 years earlier, before we got together. The house that I had moved into, contributed to financially through shared expenses, and which we had, or so I had believed, agreed would become jointly titled after the marriage. I read every page. And I found something. I'm going to pause here for a moment, because I want you to stay with me for what comes next. What I found in those documents was not dramatic on the surface. It required legal knowledge to understand the implications. But once you understood, once you saw what the structure of that ownership meant in the context of a marriage, in the context of the financial agreements we had discussed, it was devastating. The house was in a trust. A specific kind of trust, established before our relationship, that had been amended 8 months earlier, during our engagement, to include a provision that, in the event of marriage, would prevent any claim of marital property interest by a spouse. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone with legal advice. Someone who had planned, before the wedding rings were purchased, to ensure that I would have no claim on the house, regardless of what verbal agreements had been made, regardless of what I had contributed, regardless of what any reasonable person would consider fair. I sat on the floor of the study for a long time. I am not going to tell you I cried. I don't think I did. I think what happened was quieter than that. I think I felt something finalize. The way a verdict finalizes. The way a door closing finalize. Not with a bang. With a click. I thought about Vivienne reviewing the wedding budget. I thought about Marcus telling me I was cold. I thought about every dinner party where I had made myself smaller so he could feel larger. I thought about she keeps my life organized, delivered to a table of his colleagues while I sat 4 feet away. And then I thought about my father's kitchen table. The documents he hadn't read carefully enough. The thing he lost because he hadn't protected it. I thought, I am my father's daughter. But I will not make his mistake. I went ahead with the wedding. I know what you're thinking. But here's what I need you to understand. Walking away at that point would have been the emotional decision. It would have been the reactive decision. And I had already decided, sitting on that floor with those documents, that I was done making reactive decisions. I had a plan. It wasn't complete yet. But I had a direction. And the wedding, paradoxically, was part of it. Because marriage, legal marriage, with a certificate and a date and a jurisdiction, creates rights that cannot always be contracted away, regardless of what a pre-existing trust document says. Depending on how those rights are exercised, depending on what contributions can be demonstrated, depending on how a marriage is conducted and what representations are made during it, I needed to be a wife first. Then I needed to be a lawyer. So I stood at the altar. I wore the dress. I said the words. I smiled at Marcus and he smiled at me and I thought, I see you now. Completely. And I am not afraid. That wasn't even the hardest part. The reception was beautiful. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not someone who needs to poison every memory to justify what came later. The flowers were exactly what I'd specified. The food was good. The speeches were kind. My mother cried. Marcus's mother smiled her smile. At one point during the evening, I was standing near the bar with my friend Diane, one of the only people in the world who knew me fully, who had seen every version of this situation unfold over months of careful, circumspect conversation, and she leaned close to me and said, "You okay?" I said. Yes. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You're the calmest bride I've ever seen." I smiled. I said, "I know something they don't." She looked at me a beat longer. Then she said, "Good." That was all. She handed me my glass. We went back to the party. We were supposed to go to the hotel suite Marcus had booked for our wedding night. I had agreed to this. The plan was to leave the reception together, spend the night at the hotel, begin the honeymoon the following afternoon. What happened instead was this. Sometime around 11, Marcus said he needed to go to the house to pick up something he'd forgotten. He was vague about what, and that he'd meet me at the hotel. He said it quickly. Distractedly. He'd had several drinks. His tie was loosened. He kissed me on the cheek and left. I waited an hour. He didn't come to the hotel. I called. Voicemail. I texted. No reply. At 1 in the morning, still in my wedding dress, I drove to the house. Because some animal instinct that I had been disciplining for months, but that was still there, still working, told me to go there. The house was dark. His car was in the driveway. I went to the front door and used my key. It didn't work. I stood there for a moment in the silence of that residential street, in the rain that had started sometime in the last hour, in a dress that cost more than my first car, and I understood. I understood completely. The lock had been changed. On my wedding night. I want you to sit with that. I did not knock. I did not scream. I did not stand there and cry on the porch in a way that he could film or witness or use later. I walked back to my car. I got inches. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, listening to the rain on the roof. And then I drove to the hotel, because I had a room, and I was tired, and there was nothing in the world to be gained from doing anything else that night. I took off the dress. I hung it carefully on the back of the bathroom door. I ordered room service because I had barely eaten at my own reception. I sat by the window and looked at the city, and I was very, very calm. I texted Diane. It happened. She replied within 30 seconds. I'm here if you need me. I replied. I'm fine. Starting tomorrow. And then I went to sleep. The next morning, Marcus sent a text. It arrived at 7:43 am and said, "We need to talk. I'll be at the house." I replied, "Sure." I showered. I dressed carefully. I wore a cream blouse and charcoal trousers that I knew were professionally authoritative without being aggressive. I pulled my hair back. I did my makeup with the same deliberate attention I bring to preparing for a deposition. Then I called Patricia. Patricia, who had been my mentor for 3 years. Patricia, who had, over several months of careful conversation, helped me understand exactly what legal options were available to me and in what sequence they should be deployed. Patricia, who had, the previous week, filed several documents on my behalf that Marcus knew nothing about. I said, "It happened last night," Patricia said. "Okay." "Are you all right?" I said. "Yes." "I'm going to the house now," she said. "Remember, you're not there to fight. You're there to establish the record," I said. "I know," she said. "Scarlett, you've done everything right. Trust the work," I said. "I do." Marcus was standing in the kitchen when I arrived. He had coffee. He did not look like a man who had spent the night in triumphant comfort. He looked like a man who had convinced himself to do something difficult, and was now facing the woman he'd done it to, and finding it harder than anticipated. "Good," he said. "I think you know why I asked you here," I said. "Tell me," he said, "and I want to give you the exact substance of this because it matters." He said that he thought the marriage had been a mistake. That he had been pressured into it. That he cared about me but that we wanted different things, and that he thought it was better to address this now than to let it go on. He said the house was in his name. Here he glanced at me with something that was almost a test, watching for my reaction, and that he assumed we could work something out about my personal belongings. He said all of this in the reasonable, regretful tone of a man who believed he held every card. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I said, "You changed the locks last night," he said. "I needed space," I said. "On our wedding night," he said. "Scarlett," I said. "No. I'm not going to argue with you. I just want to confirm, for the record, what you're telling me. You're saying this marriage was a mistake, that you want to end it, and that you consider the house to be your property. Is that correct? He blinked. The for the record had registered. Yes. I mean, we'll figure out the logistics. But I said, thank you. I took out my phone. I sent a message. He said, what are you doing? I said, I need to pick up a few things, and I went to the study. What he didn't know was that the study contained a filing cabinet. And in that filing cabinet, over the past 3 months, I had been quietly, methodically, adding copies of documents, financial statements, bank records, correspondence, the mortgage documents, the trust documents, a printed record of every shared expense I had paid over the 18 months I had lived in that house. A record of every contribution, financial, domestic, professional, that could be demonstrated and quantified. I took the filing cabinet with me. It wasn't large. It fit in the back of my car. Marcus came to the study door and said, what is that? I said, my work files, which was true. He said, Scarlett, I think we should. I said, I'll be in touch through my attorney. He said, your attorney? And I looked at him then, really looked at him, probably for the first time in months, without the filter of hope or love or the desire to see something that wasn't there. And I said, Marcus, what did you think I did for a living? This is where I want to slow down. Because the next 30 days are where the story actually happens, and I don't want to rush them. I moved in with Diane. I went to work every day. I dressed well. I ate meals. I called my mother and told her, carefully, that Marcus and I were separating, and I listened to her cry and held the phone very steadily and said, I'm okay. Mom, I promise. I have a plan. I did not post on social media. I did not call mutual friends. I did not send emails or letters or make any public statement of any kind. I was silent in the way that a sealed courtroom is silent, not empty, not inactive, but contained. Marcus, during this period, was not silent. I heard, through channels that always exist in overlapping social circles, that he had told people we had grown apart, that I had been difficult, that the marriage had been a mutual decision. He was, I understood, preparing his narrative, building the scaffolding of a story in which he was reasonable and I was unreasonable, and the whole thing was very sad but inevitable. He also, I later learned, consulted an attorney. His attorney told him, presumably, what any competent attorney would tell him, which was that the trust structure was solid, that the house was protected, that a marriage of less than 48 hours created minimal legal exposure. His attorney was not wrong about the house, but the house was not the only thing. Here is what Marcus did not know about me during those 30 days. He did not know that Patricia had already filed, on my behalf, a complaint with the State Bar Association regarding an attorney, not Marcus's attorney, a different attorney, an attorney who had a very specific relationship with a very specific financial matter that I am not going to detail here because it is ongoing, but a complaint that, when it became public, would affect Marcus's professional reputation in ways that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with a business arrangement he had entered into with a person he should not have trusted. He did not know that I had spent the previous 3 months consulting with a forensic accountant about certain financial flows that appeared in documentation I had access to, flows that suggested a pattern of conduct that a regulatory body would find interesting. He did not know that I had maintained meticulous records of the 18 months of shared expenses I had contributed to the household, and that under a specific provision of state law that applied to domestic partnerships preceding a formal marriage, a provision that was obscure but entirely valid, those contributions created a cognizable claim that was entirely separate from any question of marital property. He did not know that Garrett, the man from the dinner party who had given me his card, worked for a real estate development company that was in the early stages of considering Marcus's firm for a significant contract. And that Garrett had, in the ordinary course of professional due diligence, requested a background review that had surfaced certain information that he had found, not the word he used, but the word I thought of when he called me, disqualifying. He did not know any of this. Because I had not told him. Because I don't perform. I deliver. On day 29, I received a call from Marcus's attorney. The tone was different from what I imagine it had been at the start of those 30 days. Measured. Careful. There was a phrase he used, mutual resolution, that told me everything I needed to know about how the previous 4 weeks had gone for Marcus. I said I would have my attorney contact him. I called Patricia. I said, "He's ready," she said. As I know. I heard from his counsel this morning. I said, "What are they offering?" She told me. I said, "No," she said. As I know. I'll go back. What happened in the negotiation is, in some respects, less important than what happened publicly. Legal settlements are private. What is not private is professional reputation. Professional standing. The network of relationships and referrals and assumptions on which an architect's practice depends. Marcus's name was removed from the consideration list for Garrett's development project on day 19. On day 23, a professional association newsletter, a boring, institutional publication that nonetheless constituted the primary communications channel for his industry network, published a brief item about a licensing matter that had come to light during a routine review. It was smaller. It was factual. It was devastating. On day 27, Vivienne called me. For the first time since the wedding. She asked if there was any way we could discuss things as a family. I said, "I don't think we are as family, Vivienne." But I appreciate the call. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know he was going to do it the way he did." I said, "I know." Another silence. She said, "You knew about all of it, didn't you?" Before the wedding, I said, "I did my due diligence." She said nothing else. I heard her breathing. Then she said, "You're remarkable." I said, "I'm my father's daughter," and I hung up. Day 30. I went to the firm. Sat at my desk. Opened my laptop. Did the work I always do, careful, precise, consequential work that exists entirely below the surface of how most people understand the world. Patricia came by my desk around noon. She set down a manila envelope. She said, "Settlement agreement." He accepted. I opened it. Read it through, all of it. Every clause. Every provision. Then I signed it and handed it back. She said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. I said, "Calibrated." She laughed, a real one. The kind she didn't give out often. "Good word," I said. "Patricia, did you ever doubt this would work?" She considered. She said, "No. But I've seen it fail for people who couldn't stay calm long enough. Who couldn't hold the line when it was hard." I said, "It wasn't that hard." She looked at me. Really, and I thought about it. The wedding night in the rain. The hotel room. The room service I ate alone in my wedding dress. The 30 days of silence. The careful, daily work of not reacting, not performing, not giving Marcus any surface to read or respond to. I said, the hardest part was the altar. Saying the words, meaning them, and knowing what I knew. She nodded slowly. That's the part that would have broken most people. I said, I know. I want to tell you about the last time I saw Marcus. It was not at a negotiation table. It was not at a dramatic public confrontation. It was at a coffee shop, mutual territory, neutral ground, chosen by him for a conversation that his attorney had apparently advised him to have. He looked different. Smaller, maybe, is the wrong word. More resolved, perhaps. Like a man who has completed a difficult calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't want but can no longer dispute. He said, "I underestimated you," I said. "Yes," he said. I thought you were just," I said. "I know what you thought." He was quiet. He looked out the window. Then he said, "What was the Garrett thing?" "Was that," I said. "I didn't engineer that. I had a conversation with a professional contact. Garrett made his own decisions." Marcus looked at me. "Did you know what he'd find?" I said. "I knew what was there to be found." He processed this. Then he said, "The trust structure was solid," I said. "It was. The house was always yours." "I knew that," he said. "Then what was I said. "Marcus." "The house was never the point." He stared at me. I said, "You made me invisible for 2 years. You planned, before we were married, to make sure I couldn't access what I'd helped build. You changed the locks on our wedding night. You told people we'd grown apart because you thought I had no way to push back." I leaned forward slightly. "The house was yours to keep. But your name in this industry, in this professional network, in the estimation of people whose opinions you've spent 15 years cultivating, that was always available to the truth." He said nothing. I picked up my coffee. I said, "I didn't take anything that wasn't real, Marcus. I just made sure that what was real became visible." I finished my coffee. I stood. I picked up my bag. I said, "You told people I kept your life organized. You weren't wrong." I just stopped and I left. This is what I want to say to you, wherever you're watching from, whatever version of this you're living. The most powerful thing I did in this entire situation was not the filing cabinet. It wasn't the forensic accounting or the bar complaint or the dinner party conversation with Garrett. Those were tactics. They mattered, but they were tactical. The most powerful thing I did was decide, clearly, early, on the floor of a study in a house where my name was about to be nowhere, to stop asking Marcus to see me. To stop performing visibility for someone who had chosen not to look. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being underestimated by someone you love. It is different from the exhaustion of being underestimated by a stranger or an enemy. It has a particular weight because it's contaminated by hope, by the constant possibility that if you just explain better, or show up more, or achieve something undeniable enough, they'll finally adjust their understanding of you. They won't. Not always. Sometimes the adjustment only happens when the cost of not adjusting becomes real. Marcus adjusted. Eventually. In a coffee shop. Over coffee I had ordered and paid for myself. He adjusted. But I want to be clear. His adjustment was not the victory. His adjustment was not even particularly satisfying. By the time it happened, I had already moved past the part where his opinion of me was something I needed. The victory was the day I decided to stop needing it. My name is Scarlett Thomas. I'm 26 years old. I have a master's degree in financial law that I never mentioned at dinner parties. I have a mentor who wears the same pearl earrings every day and who believed in my work when I was still learning to believe in it myself. I have a friend named Diane who asked if I was okay at a wedding reception and understood. From 2 words. Everything she needed to know. I have a career. I have savings. I have a filing system that has, on multiple occasions, proven to be the most important thing in the room. And I have a lesson that cost me 2 years and 1 wedding night in the rain, but that I would not trade for anything. Don't perform your competence for people who aren't paying attention. Build it. Document it. Use it when it matters. Let them assume. Let them organize their world around an understanding of you that is comfortable and diminishing and entirely incorrect. Let them change the locks. Because nothing teaches someone who you are like the moment they realize what they've just locked out. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it mapped onto something you've lived or are living right now, leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what part landed. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who is standing outside their own locked door, trying to figure out if they have the right to be angry, the right to act, the right to trust what they know, send this to them. Because the answer is yes. They do. You do. And when the time comes, and it will come, trust the work.